There are a lot of MMOs that were put into a world of deep lore, given lush environments, some strong mechanics, and a good core base of players for a while others, well, maybe they just weren't. But the world that they were set in begs the question, what if they developed a sequel and worked on their mistakes from the first or even the last time around? There are tons of MMOs set in worlds that were developed over decades with lore, interesting characters and storylines, and may have just lost the sight with their previous title. Of course, there are some heavy hitters, the big juggernaut MMOs, that would be fun to see a follow-up title from, but there are also some lesser known games that I believe could put together a good or even great sequel if they continue their efforts in the right places. Now, there's also some titles on here that were shelved, possibly even teased to be coming back, and then also possibly even shelved once again, because we do not know much about them. But I thought that we could hypothetically give these titles a name, give them some core features, and then we could see how a sequel in that world would work successfully. This list is, like I said, more of a hypothetical list and just for fun. And it would also be quite hard to cover all of the MMOs in the spectrum that we would like to see a sequel for. So if there is a MMO that you would like to see a sequel for, or that you're anticipating one from, throw it in the comments and we can get to theorizing about them. Alright, now these are the 10 MMOs that I would love to see a sequel from in the future. Dragon's Dogma Online released in the East back in August of 2015, but unfortunately it never made its way over to the West. The game shut down in December of last year, so it did not last quite too long, but the game did offer quite a lot of interesting features that could be put into a future sequel and be expanded upon for a strong MMO. Dragon's Dogma Online was similar to your Monster Hunters and your Dauntless games, where you would come by larger enemies and mobs, and it would take a lot in order to take them down. One of the problems with the game is that they just offered 4-player co-op, and it was never really much of an open world MMO, but with a sequel, that can definitely be worked upon. Dragon's Dogma Online 2 could be more successful if the world was open to more players, and then instance based on several channels. The towns and the cities can be filled with people, but the world does not have to seem like you're playing in Dauntless, which is not an MMO. Not only should they feature the large enemies, but dungeons and raids with 10 people or 20 people to take their PvE to the next level, as well as offer arenas for those who want to show off their gear that they crafted from the content that they tackled. A large part of games similar to this style, where you take down large enemies or bosses, is being able to show off the loot that you got, or being able to use that loot in order to craft something out of it, like gear or weapons. So by doing these things, you can see the fan base that enjoys the series and games similar to it, but also drag in some other fans of PvE in MMOs, like they want to tackle their dungeons, the harder, higher end dungeons and raids and stuff like that. It's a shame that the original closed down, and since it was only in the East, I never tried it myself, but I do hope for fans of the title that maybe even a private server can open up for them, but would also love to see a sequel to the MMO. Now, yeah, there is technically an Ion 2 out there, but no, it is not made for the PC or even the consoles, because it's a mobile game, which is pretty unfortunate. I recently made a video about jumping back into Ion in 2020, and sure, the game is less populated, but the game is also quite different from its beginning years after launch. If Ion were to make a follow-up MMO, there is a lot that can be explored with the lore, and once again bringing back the flying, and just to say, do a better job with it. In Ion 2, flying can be used throughout a majority of the game instead of just limiting the player with it and having to use potions just to keep up your timer. The content can be based a lot more around the flying, such as dungeons and raids, requiring a lot of mechanics to be based around the flying. The PvPvE can be worked on better, especially with a better engine than the Cry engine that they use, because it runs terribly, especially when there's a lot of people on the screen. Maybe they can, switch over to Unreal Engine 4 or one of the updated versions of Unreal Engine 4, something like that. I think that Ion had a lot of great ideas, but the execution of their engine and the flying mechanic was really missed. With a sequel, they can definitely explore a lot more of the lore around Atreya, possibly in the future of it or something like that. Forget that they pretty much destroyed the Abyss and try to work around that, bring back that PvPvE content and a lot of the interesting content that they had. Maybe maybe they have exploration be a large part, especially with the flying being such a great dynamic. I think a great feature would be to highlight the exploration, especially with the flying dynamic. That could be something that could be explored a lot and expanded upon. Also, sieges should be a core feature again, as well as flying around without being limited, and continue to push the PvE with the raiding content. In the beginning, their PvE scene wasn't the best, but it was pretty good. I know this might sound like I'm picking on a lot of different things, but I definitely think that if there was a sequel to Ion, that they can work on all of the mishappenings of their updates through the years and really push the flying, because I don't think flying was really pushed in any other MMO to a really high degree. And I think that's something that they should really work upon if there was a sequel in the future. EverQuest is one of the most influential MMOs ever to be made, and one can also even argue that it could be the most influential, as it was the first to really be a successful 3D MMO in a genre that just started out. Its sequel, EverQuest 2, was a little bit less successful than the first one, but both games have had a fan base for years and years, and it clearly showed that there was a future for the series when EverQuest Next was announced. That it pretty much was left hanging by a thread until it was canceled by Daybreak years ago, and then it was bought out and all that junk. Now, there have been news speculating that an EverQuest BR, yes, I said EverQuest BR, for some reason, was surfacing. So I'm just going to ignore that and continue to theorize about if EverQuest Next, or whatever they want to call it, would offer if it was going to be made in the future. Now, what we do know about EverQuest Next in the past, they boasted about having this mainly or completely destructible environment that you can build upon and destroy it, something that you would see in like Battlefield. And while I think it's ambitious for the scale of an MMO, I think that something can be drawn from that, because they did say that it was pretty much impossible given their engine and the dynamics of it. What if certain parts of the world's environment were dynamic and destructible, and that you can be able to use that within your combat? So for example, certain parts of a torn down ruin can be struck and a couple pieces fell on the ground. The player can use it to maybe distract an NPC by throwing it somewhere, or maybe they could even use the rock in PvP to bash the enemy on the head or something like that. Also, with the past EverQuest, the main focus for their games was, I would say, the PvE. So I would like to see that be explored a little bit more, so with possibly certain quests being tailored for group content in dungeons and raids, because, you know, MMO should be more tailored around group content, and I think that EverQuest, being the staple, did a pretty good job with it. The other thing that I thought of that could be interesting with how their environments work is if they had rifts similar to how Rift had their, well, rifts, but instead they had these dynamic moments that stemmed from something happening, such as foreign villagers pillaging a tavern and then they ran off. And then you get to decide that you can either help them and keep what those pillagers took as sort of a reward, or if not, that tavern is now gonna look different. They sell less items like potions and stuff like that, and they also sell them for a higher price because they need to make their money back. I know random events are hard like this because you want people to participate and not make them stagnant, so everyone knows what to expect every time they do it. You know, maybe they can do it less often and have the reward be a lot higher, but they do have to somehow affect the player if they choose one option or the other option, which I know is a large part as in why there's a lot of stagnant and linear quest lines. And the rifts are like pretty close to doing a good job of it, but that's just an idea, something like that. You know, something can be applied in a way for battlegrounds that are just not players killing each other or capturing an objective. Maybe that they can use these battlegrounds in the same way that they're dynamic, you know, defending a cave full of miners where one side is attacking, the other side is defending, and at the same time that you can kind of also capture objectives within the mine, you know, something like that. I think that the game could be set up to have the world be a little bit more dynamic than just, you know, the cookie cutter kind of quest and stuff like that. But also, I feel like I'm rambling at this point, so yeah, I don't know. EverQuest Next, you think it's gonna come out? Let me know. Star Wars has had 2 MMOs, and yeah, the Old Republic is still alive and doing pretty well. You know, somewhat of the heart is still kicking there, but you know, this might be the least likely to happen in the near future out of every MMO on this list, because unless the game has to be shut down as it makes no more money, I can't really see any developer really saying, oh, let's go ahead and spend a ton of money again on making another Star Wars MMO. But since we're talking about hypothetics here and we're going to be hypothetical, if we did get another MMO, I think that fans would absolutely love to jump into it, obviously because it is Star Wars. And maybe the next one could do some things a little bit different than the last one. While I do think that SWTOR storylines are probably the highlight of the game, and not even probably, like they are the highlight of the game, it doesn't really deliver much of a massively multiplayer feel for an MMO. I mean, you know, massively and multiplayer are the largest part of being an MMO, and it kind of feels like you're playing a single player game. Sure, we would love to have these rich storylines for a future MMO, but maybe they can dial it back just a little bit in a way to include more group content and maybe not just keep the focus on the conversations with the NPCs for revealing the story. Also, another problem for SWTOR, which was similar to Ion, was their engine and how poorly it handled the massive open world PvP. So maybe a different engine this time in order to sustain a larger amount of people on your screen and without endless amounts of lag. As far as what the game can offer with its features, well, it's Star Wars and there's a lot to explore. I think something that Galaxies did well, which is the MMO before SWTOR, was the fleet gameplay, or the flying your own ship gameplay that they had. And SWTOR wasn't as robust as it was in Galaxies, and I think that a lot of interesting PvE and PvP content could come from that. I think, you know, it's Star Wars. Everyone wants to fly their own shit throughout space. There could be 5-man missions to escort people, kill larger named enemies, and just ultimately just a more robust system to introduce some fun content. While I enjoy both tab targeting and action combat in MMOs, I see Star Wars being better with an action combat system similar to what you would see in Terra, because them having lightsabers and your missiles hitting would feel so much more impactful. Like, imagine having a lightsaber and your enemy also has one and you just trying to freely swing and hit them. It would just feel so much more like full and fulfilling. You know, I would love to see like a marauder holding 2 lightsabers and being able to freely try to dodge the ranged missiles and possibly deflect them back at your enemy instead of it being left up to chance to dodge or parry them. Star Wars has a huge world to explore, and we know this. You know, its environments often speak for themselves. So I think if they made the environments feel a bit more lively, especially in the cities, and a little bit more full, feeling like they do in the movies when your favorite characters are seen walking through towns, it kind of feels more immersive with the experience. Now, last thing I would like to see is to expand on the datacrons. I think that was something that I enjoyed a lot from SWTOR, and it really helps the players get out of the usual content and just travel to different zones and explore and try to figure out these little puzzles that they're not necessary, but they're just fun to complete. Rift released back in 2011 with a pretty strong release, and they had a good fan base for quite some time. But where I think they messed up for the first time was trying to be the quote-unquote WoW killer and advertising as so. Second was with how they ended up presenting their microtransactions in the store over the years, which was pretty abysmal. And then their third mistake was with the Rift Prime, which is still a mess, and it was always a mess. So with all of those things covered, you might ask, why would we trust Trion and Gamago, who bought out Trion, considering they did the same things with ArcAge? Well, since we are speaking about what ifs and hypotheticals, I think a Rift 2 could be presented with a pretty good game and hopefully a better payment model than the current one. I played Rift for quite a while from launch, and after their first expansion pretty casually, and I really enjoyed it. I think the features it had were pretty strong, and a future MMO within the Rift world could boast for some pretty great additions to it. First off, the Rift system, which took Warhammer's system of public quest and they built it into a superior one. Their endgame rating was one of the better ones with, you know, there was some issues, but it was still pretty good. Then you had the PvP, which was nothing crazy and actually pretty standard. So I think if they implemented PvP and their rifts into a feature, it could be pretty interesting. You know, they could have battlefields with several large rifts opening up on the battlefield, and players have to defeat these rifts that open up for a certain amount of progression, or they can go on the defense and attack the other team while they're trying to tackle the rifts. That could be like this pretty cool PvPvE dynamic that I think isn't too crazy for Rift, and it kind of works within their wheelhouse with the rifts. The way I see it, like I said, there could be like a completion meter, and with each rift that you close, you get a certain amount. Each PvP kill that will give you a certain amount, like 1% or 0.5% or something like that. And then maybe even having objectives in the game and capturing those will also give you some. Now, I really enjoy the PvPv dynamic in games, so I think it could be interesting to add it into a future rift if that is the possibility. Their talent trees were a fun, integral part, or at least I hope so, because whatever they did to change them, it was kind of disappointing. But at launch, it was a lot of fun. They kind of took away the freedom of the builds, with each update kind of limiting more and more stuff. But I think with a follow-up MMO, that they can allow for players to experiment once again with builds. Dungeons & Dragons Online has been out for quite some years now, and to my knowledge, it was the first pay-to-play MMO to make the transition to a free-to-play MMO. DDO released in 2006, so it is quite dated by now, but given it is set in the Dungeons & Dragons world, it might be one of the best titles to get an MMO from. Although the game never really took off, I think it is time that we actually see they move on to a sequel. And yes, we do have Neverwinter, which is also set within the Dungeons & Dragons franchise, or the world rather. I think a DDO 2 could bestow a little bit more success for its series. If you think about what makes Dungeons & Dragons so much fun to play, is the freedom to do what you can imagine. And also if your dungeon master allows it. But I think the world of Dungeons & Dragons is amazing to explore because of the freedom. I think that the character customization from the first DDO is strong, and it should be pretty similar to that, where you can customize a lot of your character and the traits as well. A sequel should focus a lot more on the exploration and the toughness of battles that you come across, kind of similar to Dark Souls or even Dauntless and games like that, instead of large amounts of mobs and AoEing all of them down like you would see in Rift or World of Warcraft. For example of something that you would see, maybe you're just exploring and you see this cave, and it takes you all the way down to the deep depths of it, and the only light you have is your torch and maybe the torches from the other players in your party, and you just want to find the loot at the bottom or see if there's any loot at all. It would be cool to just happen to come across something and explore it, and maybe you have a quest for it back in the city or something. But really what I think should be the change, when you verse the mobs or the enemies that you face, they should be a little bit more difficult. The game should have a little bit more strategy involved when it comes to the combat. And then as far as the other content goes, I think that the dungeons and raids should be a staple like it is in DDO, as I believe it still is, as well as having open world PvP. But maybe to change it up a little bit, there could be like this confrontation that has to be had before you go in to just try and gank someone. There's no doubt that the story for a sequel would be very interesting for players to play through, and I think that Dungeons & Dragons Online could definitely use a sequel after all of these years that it has been out. So Lineage has teased Lineage Eternal or Project TL for years and years, and then they went quiet for the last couple of years, but we do believe that it is still now being developed, and apparently the direction that they're heading in was not the outcome that they went with, so they went back to the drawing boards, and I hear that they are gearing up to release it soon. So now that it is 2020, and NCSoft has shown that they're still working on the game, and possibly with a open beta this year, what is it that we can expect from the game? First off, the game is the sequel to the first Lineage, so I've read that the story is going to be in between the first and the second one, but unlike Lineage 1 and 2, and if you don't know this, the game is an isometric MMORPG. The game features are going to be similar to what you would see in Lost Ark, where you'll go through a main story and have some side quests. You can do dungeons and raids and instance PvP, as well as you can venture out into the world and kill some world bosses or try and take down your enemies in open world PvP. Now, there is a lot that has been kept secret about the game as of right now, but if there are some other things that I would like to see from the game, it would to be trying to bring the fortress sieges that they have in Lineage 2, I believe, into this isometric MMO. And I would also love to see a robust crafting system and not something that's going to be like all of these other RNG based crafting systems where that, you know, people who spend money can get the advantage to buy materials or resources on the cash out. Aside from that, I think it will still deliver a lot of the same things, like I said, that you'll see in Lost Ark. So we will see how it shapes up and if this is even going to go into a beta this year. As a huge Warhammer Age of Reckoning fan and someone who plays on the private server Return of Reckoning, I believe that there is a chance that a good Warhammer MMO can happen in the future. Unfortunately, problems in every facet plagued the existence of Age of Reckoning, and the Warhammer 40k MMO Eternal Crusade is basically empty of people now. Warhammer fans are definitely itching for a new release. Warhammer Online had introduced many things into the MMO industry as standards, such as your public quest and the Tome of Knowledge, but its PvP is so much fun. I think that the new MMO would first off need to not have EA anywhere close to being involved with it, because that was pretty much the demise of Age of Reckoning. And I do think that keeping the focus on PvP would be smart, but introduce the Skaven as a real third faction. So something similar to how Dark Ages of Camelot does their open world PvP with 3 factions, so that it's not just one-sided against the other in open world PvP. If the open world PvP remained a large part, having the Skaven territories to explore into would be quite enticing, especially with the dark and mythic aesthetic of the Warhammer world. In addition to the open world PvP, having battlegrounds and max level rated battlegrounds would be interesting, like they have in the private server. I think that they can work on this story a bit more on the side of that as well. Warhammer is filled with lore, and they can introduce some great storylines to explore. Now, I'm not saying it has to be like SWTOR, but more so on the lines of like Guild Wars 2 or World of Warcraft, where players can get into it pretty casually. And lastly, the PvE in Warhammer Online was never something to write home about. I mean, it was pretty standard, but for some reason they tend to focus a lot on their efforts in trying to introduce more players to get into the PvE, but really we just enjoy the PvP. I think the PvE should stay within the game, but maybe introduce once again a more PvPvE element like Ion with their Abyss. So my idea is, you know, Warhammer is known for its sieges, right? So maybe one area where all 3 factions have to quickly capture objectives, kill certain named bosses, a certain amount of other faction players, and then defend their castle against the other 2 factions that lost to the one who basically won, I guess you could call it. And now the faction who is defending, of course, they'll get NPCs to help them out, like actually good AI NPCs. This is kind of just a way to like elevate the sieges up to a next tier. Maybe this is just for the max level characters as well. Sieges are the large part of why Warhammer Online's open world PvP is, I would say, successful, but it's also just so much fun. And I think if you just took that up a notch in a future MMO for a Warhammer world, that could be really interesting to explore. Age of Conan may still be around, but it was never able to fully take off, with their release having a lot of performance issues and optimization issues. The Conan franchise and the story is a great world to explore for an MMO, especially with its brutal and dark aesthetic. If hypothetically, once again, Funcom developed an Age of Conan 2 or a sequel, there can be a lot of issues resolved and great ideas further optimized. First off, I can see the game taking their combat to something also closer to Terra, where the combat feels a little bit more rewarding. It was okay, it wasn't amazing, but it was a little clunky. The story can also continue to evolve, and although I never got far into the game, I heard its story was quite good with their DLCs. Something that you can take away from a barbaric world is the savagery. So something similar to what I described with EverQuest, dynamic missions, or whatever they would be called, you know, that could be cool in a world like this. I would love to be able to have arenas and cities with crowds filling the seats, and even active players could be in the seats watching them and like throwing rocks or something like that, like you see in the Gulag in Call of Duty Warzone. And it would be cool to see them go head to head in like 1 versus 1s or 2 versus 2s, and then the losers have to spend their time doing like volunteer missions for the city in order to get out of it, and then the winners get some loot. Something to, you know, make it worthwhile, and also having these leaderboards to climb so that you can show off to other people, kind of similar to what they did in vanilla or classic WoW with the PvP titles. Now, I saw Age of Conan added this in about 4 years ago, but also quite a while after its launch and when less people were playing. The game also had sieges, but performance issues plagued them like Ion and Warhammer, so I'd like to see them to continue with those in Age of Conan 2. You know, like I just explained with Warhammer, sieges are a great time, and I love that. I also think that the game could do well with PvE arenas, where you have to fight off like hordes of guards or different types of NPCs as you fight them off, and then maybe every 5 or 10 levels or whatever they would be called, you progress you can get better rewards for better gear. The Conan franchise is definitely great for future games, and I think it could do very well for follow-up MMO to the first Age of Conan. And if it was ever done, hopefully they take the time to finish up optimizing their game so not only the high-end computers can run the game, but would love to see a future follow-up for this game in the near future. Some of you might already be aware that there is a new Lord of the Rings MMO being made, and by none other than Amazon Game Studios. Right now, we don't really know anything about the game aside that is said to be a free-to-play MMO coming to the PC and the consoles in the future. Recently, there have been job listings for designer positions, so they are quite early in the process, but it is still exciting to see that we will be getting a new Lord of the Rings MMO in the future. Lord of the Rings Online, which is the current MMO out, has been out since 2007 and made the move to go free to play right after Dungeons and Dragons Online did so. Now, with Amazon just now starting to put out their games, we still don't know how they are as a company when it comes to dealing with not only games but also their MMOs. Our first taste will be with New Worlds, which is set to come out sometime this year. Now, I'm hopeful that they can at least do justice with a Lord of the Rings title because, you know, there's a lot to explore with the world and it is Lord of the Rings, so it's a big, hefty title. One other thing that while I was writing this I found out is that we do know that the timeline is said to be before the books, so that's going to be interesting how they design their storyline and how it ties into the characters and the world that we already know. I hope to see them push the story along with the strong storytelling and quest, but once again, not really like SWTOR because that felt once, like I've been saying, too single player-y, but I also think that they can somehow push that along like Guild Wars 2 does with their quests. I also think that they should continue to push the game in a PvE focused based with dungeons and raids that also ties into the overlying story somehow. One of the amazing things that I enjoyed about Lord of the Rings Online were all of these small things that made the game so great, like, you know, just simple things like instruments being played, and the towns really feel like you are in Lord of the Rings. It's almost like your character is in the real world and like you're immersed in this feeling. The zones were also really beautiful, so I hope that they can continue to bring the massive impact with Amazon's upcoming Lord of the Rings MMO. Alright, this one was a little bit of a longer one because, you know, I was kind of just going off of tangents and ideas, but there we go, there we have it. It's once again, it's just a hypothetical what if list, so I hope you guys enjoyed it. I like to theorize about like what if a new game came out and what I would like to see from that game in that world or whatever it is, so that's why I decided to put this one together. But also let me know what you guys want to see a sequel from, if it ever happens, or if not, just let me know down in the comments down below, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.